Hello, welcome to Martin Van Buren National Historic Site here in Kinderhook, New York. My name is Jim McKay. I'm going to demonstrate some of the interpretive techniques that we use here at the park to incorporate women into the story of antebellum history and Martin Van Buren's political life. I'll demonstrate some of those techniques, and then later on we'll have a little bit of a discussion of how we went about incorporating those and the process of why those stories of women were incorporated into our regular interpretive program. Thanks. We're here in the library at Lindenwold. This room was added to the home in 1849. Really interesting time in the history of the farm here in the mansion, Lindenwold, as Martin Van Buren called it. Also a really compelling and interesting time in the nation's history. A year before this edition was begun, of course, the Mexican War had just ended, and also Martin Van Buren had completed his run for the presidency in 1848 as the candidate of the Free Soil Party. And then, of course, the following year, after this edition was completed, the Compromise of 1850 had further divided the nation over the issue of extending slavery to the territories won from Mexico. On a personal level, Martin Van Buren's niece, Christina Cantine, who grew up in Catskill, which is a village across the river from across the Hudson River here from Kinderhook, where Lindenwold is, she was a religious person. She was motivated by a lot of the evangelical fervor of the Second Great Awakening. And she had used that motivation always to prod her uncle on the issues of the day. In 1852, 2 years after the addition of this room, Christina gave her uncle, President Van Buren, a Bible. And in the inside cover of the Bible, she quoted one of the Psalms, and it's very, very moving what is written. I'd like to just read a little bit of what Christina Cantine wrote in the Bible that she gave to her uncle, because it really demonstrates on a very deep and personal level the anguish that the country was going through at this particular time. This is 1852, it would be December of that year. And she writes in part, "O most powerful and glorious Lord God, the Lord of hosts, stir up, O Lord, thy strength, and come and help us. Take and defend our country in this its hour of peril. Revive in our hearts a spirit to public good." Now that's pretty amazing. It's 9 years before the Civil War actually began, yet here's a really moving appeal by a young woman to a man who was central to the politics of the day, and I think it's very emotional, and it demonstrates that the nation did not approach the Civil War with any ease at all.
Christina Cantine is an excellent example of what Paula Baker calls the domestication of politics. Women aren't permitted to vote in this country for another 70 years, yet here's an example of a young woman who is motivated by religion to address the political issues of the day that are dividing the nation.
We'll move on to another room in the house and talk about one of the other characters here in a moment. One of the most interesting and compelling stories that we have here to tell at Lindenwold is the story of the Irish refugees from the famine in Ireland beginning in the 1840s. Many of the Irish women, young women, worked as domestic servants here in the household. This would have been the servants' dining room here in the cellar of the house. The domestic servants are really important on a number of levels to understand the social structure of the antebellum period of time, as well as some of the political issues that arose during this period of time. Here in the dining room, they took their meals, of course. They did receive room and board as part of their compensation. They also received a wage, which was the going rate, usually between $2 and $3 a week, depending on their experience. The types of women that worked here, or the types of employees that they had here, were cooks. They would have laundresses, and Van Buren also had maids to take care of the various rooms in the house. We're going to take a look at some of the rooms that the servants worked in here in the cellar, and we'll talk a little bit more about their important effect on how we interpret the antebellum political period at this time. All right, we're here in the laundry room of Linden Wald, again down in the cellar of the home. The laundress, I believe, had the most difficult, physically most difficult job of the servants in the household. Tremendous amount of lifting, lugging, filling the boilers that you see on the floor here with water, bringing them over to the stove to be heated. It's nice and cool down here today, as it is throughout the summer. However, during the time that the house was occupied, of course, there were fires burning day and night throughout the year. So not quite as comfortable as it might be right now. The work that the servants did in the household was indeed very difficult, and they were not compensated well, as we discussed in the servants' dining room. They received probably $2 or $3 a week, and as well as room and board. They were on call 24 hours a day. They worked 7 days a week, yet they came. Of course, they were fleeing the starvation in Ireland as a result of the potato blight. And the Irish are emblematic of succeeding waves with immigrants into this country that continues today, who are having some phenomenon pushing them from their old country, some kind of strife or starvation or political upheaval there, and they're coming here because there's opportunity. The women who work here would typically work for perhaps a year and a half, 2 years, and then they would leave here and go on to one of the cities north of here, Albany or Troy or perhaps Schenectady. There were larger populations of Irish in those cities. These were young women, and they left perhaps for their opportunity or to meet a young man, and so that they could perhaps start a family. And also important to remember, they were Catholics, and there were no Catholic churches in the Kinderhook area. The closest Catholic church to Kinderhook was in the town of Chatham, which is 7 miles from here, not far by our standards today, but of course in 1850, say, that was an all-day journey there and back. In addition to that, they didn't have the time off in any case. In a couple of ways, the experience of the women in the cellar here is interesting, and it's indicative of many aspects of American history at the time. For instance, the anxiety that exists, the anxiety over using domestic servants in this new republic. And here in the cellar, you have this spatial segregation. You can see quite clearly this is not part of the living space. This is the workspace. It's adorned plainly, and it's meant for the heavy labor that happened here. Again, wouldn't be as comfortable as it is right now. The other element of the Irish, which I think is really, really important to understand about the antebellum period, is the political effect of the massive waves of immigration in the North during this period of time. So much so, the great numbers of Irish that came to the cities in the North at this period of time had such an effect, so much so that Senator John Calhoun from South Carolina brought them up in the debates over the Compromise of 1850. He quite explicitly said in his speech on the floor of the Senate that the South had to have the new territory captured from Mexico be slave states because there was going to be a census taking place in 1850, and as a result of that census and the increase in population in the North would get additional seats in the Congress as the Congress was reapportioned as a result of the census, as the Constitution says. And the great wave of Irish that occurred over the succeeding decade had in fact begun to tilt the balance of power in Congress, where the North was starting to overcome the bonus that the slave states got as a result of their slaves, the 3/5 compromise, you'll recall from the Constitution. We have one more room to take a look at down cellar here, and then we'll move on to the family space upstairs on the second floor of the house. Here in the servant's bedroom here in the cellar at Lindenwald, a very sparse room by today's standards, but recall that the women coming here were fleeing starvation in Ireland. I've mentioned also several times as we've been going through the cellar here, the amount of money that they made, which again was modest. However, in the aggregate, these women were saving their money to feed their families back in Ireland or to bring them here to the United States. A couple of items I'd like to point out here, which I think are important to notice, are the rosary on the bedpost here. Again, these women were Catholics. A lot of discrimination against Catholics in the United States at the time. And also the trunk that you see here, they came here with very, very little. And yet, as I said earlier, there was opportunity here, and this is indicative of the opportunity that exists for immigrants in this country today and why people still continue to emigrate to the United States. Finally, I'd like to point out the call bell here. It was a job where the women were on call 24 hours a day, and they had very little privacy in the household here, as you can see from the call bell. Thanks. Welcome to the second floor of Lindenwald. This is the family's floor, where the family's bedrooms were located in the house. Very genteel, contrasts quite a bit, I think, with the servants' areas that we saw earlier. This is the room of Angelica Van Buren and Abraham Van Buren, Martin Van Buren's son and his daughter-in-law. Angelica had a direct role in Martin Van Buren's administration when he served as president. She was the hostess for the White House. She had married Abraham in the year 1838, second year of Van Buren's administration. And Van Buren being a widower, his wife died in 1819. It was of critical social importance for a man of Van Buren's stature, the chief magistrate, the president of the United States, to have a woman to deal with the social realities as they existed in Washington at the time. The importance of is underscored by the case of Margaret Eaton during Andrew Jackson's administration, which Van Buren figured in prominently. As a result of that scandal surrounding Margaret Eaton, Andrew Jackson, and President Van Buren, the entire cabinet resigned during Jackson's administration, and most of that social turmoil that caused that had to do with many of the wives of the cabinet members, as well as the wife of the vice president, who was John Calhoun at the time. In any case, Van Buren was quite happy that his son Abraham married Angelica. Angelica had a lot of social graces. She served an important function. Even today, Angelica is represented in the White House. The portrait that you see behind me here is a portrait by Healy. It's a reproduction. The original portrait is in the Red Room today at the White House.
Angelica Van Buren plays a second important role as part of our interpreter program here, and that is as a representative of the South. She grew up in South Carolina. She was a member of the breathtakingly wealthy Singleton family, and as such, she represents a very important part of Martin Van Buren's concept of the Democratic Party. His original conception of the party in the 1820s, when he was going about forming it, was that it would represent the interest of the plain Republicans of the North, as he called the small farmers in the North, and the planters of the South. And by representing the common interests of both groups, it would help to bind the country together. Actually, he did a pretty fair job, and the Democratic Party did a pretty fair job of that over a 30-year period, but it was ultimately not able to overcome the differences that the sections had over slavery. As an example of the personal being political, Angelica is a wonderful example. In 1852, she inherited from her father Richard, when he died, 2 plantations and over 300 slaves. And you can imagine the discomfort in the household with the likes of Christina Cantine on the one hand, representing the awakening morality of Republican motherhood in the North, and Angelica Singleton Van Buren representing the South. Thank you for spending some time with me and Lindenwald and exploring the lives of three women who help us to tell the story of antebellum history and of Martin Van Buren's life. Thanks.